beneath towering granite cliffs where eagles circle endless thermals, where glacial winds howl through passes that have witnessed the rise and fall of empires. A forgotten king once ruled territories that stretched from the Black Sea to the gates of Jerusalem. His name was Tigranes the Great, and for one shining moment in history, he commanded an empire that rivaled Rome itself. From his marble palaces in Artashat, this Armenian monarch projected power across 3 continents. His armies crushed the last remnants of Alexander's legacy. His treasuries overflowed with tribute from conquered cities, and his royal title, King of Kings, struck terror into Roman hearts. Yet today, few remember the mountain realm that briefly stood as equal to Rome and Parthia, challenging the ancient world's greatest powers before vanishing into the mists of forgotten history. High in the rugged mountains, where Europe surrenders to Asia, where the snows of Ararat glisten eternal against azure skies, an ancient land waited for its moment of destiny. This realm stretched across volcanic plateaus carved by time itself, a domain of soaring peaks and fertile valleys, of rushing rivers and alpine meadows that had witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties since the dawn of civilization. Here, at the crossroads of 3 continents, geography itself had forged a people destined for greatness. The mountain strongholds commanded the ancient world's most crucial passages. Through these heights flowed the lifeblood of international commerce, caravans heavy with Chinese silk bound for Roman markets, Persian spices destined for Mediterranean tables, and Scythian gold that would grace the treasuries of distant monarchs. Every merchant traveling between the civilized worlds of Mesopotamia and Anatolia, between the riches of India and the dominion of Rome, passed through valleys controlled by mountain lords. This geographic blessing would prove both the region's greatest advantage and its most dangerous curse. The people who inhabited these commanding heights bore the legacy of ages in their blood, descendants of Indo-European tribes who had swept down from the steppes centuries earlier. They had mingled with the indigenous peoples of the mountains to create something entirely new. These highland warriors possessed the fierce autonomy of mountain folk, tempered by the sophistication that came from managing vital caravan routes. Their language, their customs, their very identity reflected this unique synthesis of nomadic tradition and settled civilization. Before native dynasties claimed these heights, the mighty realm of Urartu had dominated the region for half a millennium. The Urartian rulers had been masters of their age, builders of impregnable fortresses perched on mountain peaks, creators of irrigation systems that turned barren valleys into gardens, pioneers of ironworking techniques that gave their armies decisive advantages over bronze-wielding enemies. Their capital at Tushpa commanded Lake Van like a jewel set in a crown of volcanic stone, while their strongholds dotted the landscape from the Euphrates to the Araxes. The Urartians had understood what geography demanded of those who would rule these mountains. Authority flowed not from managing vast plains where armies could maneuver freely, but from commanding the narrow passes through which all traffic must move. They built their citadels at crucial choke points, collecting tolls from passing merchants while maintaining the martial strength necessary to protect caravan routes from raiders. This fusion of commercial acumen and military might would become the mountain way of dominion for centuries to come. When Eurasian authority finally collapsed before Sumerian invasions and internal strife around 600 BC, the political vacuum created opportunities for new dynasties to emerge. The mountain tribes who inherited these heights possessed more than geography. They carried within their collective memory the accumulated wisdom of Eurasian statecraft. The fortress-building techniques, the bureaucratic systems, The diplomatic traditions that had enabled Urartu to dominate the region for centuries survived in the hands of local chieftains who understood their value. The Orontid dynasty arose from this chaos as the first truly native royal house. These mountain monarchs claimed descent from the legendary patriarch Haik, mythical founder of the nation, while pragmatically adapting to the political realities that governed Highland warfare. Orontes I, the dynasty's founder, established his authority through a combination of martial prowess and diplomatic cunning that would characterize local statecraft for generations. Under Orontid rule, the realm developed the structures that would enable future greatness. The feudal system that emerged distributed authority among regional lords while maintaining central coordination necessary for defense against external threats. Each Nakara family managed its ancestral domains with near absolute authority, yet all acknowledged their obligations to the supreme monarch when external dangers required unified response. This decentralized structure provided remarkable resilience. Enemies might defeat individual lords or even capture the capital, but they could never destroy Highland resistance entirely. The Orontid monarchs understood that survival in their dangerous neighborhood required more than martial strength. The realm lay squeezed between the expanding forces of Achaemenid Persia to the east and the Greek cities of Anatolia to the west, while Assyrian and later Babylonian armies pressed from the south. No mountain host, however brave or skillful, could hope to match the massive legions that these great dynasties could deploy. Highland autonomy would depend on diplomatic finesse, careful timing, and the ability to exploit conflicts between more formidable neighbors. Orontes II demonstrated this approach during the tumultuous 4th century BC, when Alexander the Great's conquests shattered the ancient order throughout the Near East. While Persian satrapies fell like wheat before the Macedonian scythe, the mountain realm maintained its self-rule through careful neutrality and tactical accommodation. The monarch neither actively opposed Alexander nor fully submitted to him, walking the narrow path between defiance and capitulation that would become his people's specialty. The death of Alexander and the subsequent wars of succession among his generals created even greater opportunities for Highland maneuvering. The Seleucid dynasty that eventually claimed dominion over much of Alexander's eastern territories included the mountain realm within its theoretical boundaries, but the practical difficulties of governing mountain peoples from Syrian capitals meant that Seleucid oversight remained largely nominal. Local rulers acknowledged Seleucid suzerainty when convenient, while maintaining effective self-rule in their mountain strongholds. This period of creative subordination enabled the realm to absorb the benefits of Hellenistic civilization without sacrificing its essential identity. Greek architectural techniques influenced the construction of new palaces and temples, while Hellenistic bureaucratic methods were adapted to local needs. Most importantly, contact with Greek commercial networks expanded regional participation in international commerce, far beyond what geography alone would have permitted. The establishment of new caravan routes following Alexander's conquests transformed the realm's economic position dramatically. The mountain territory found itself at the center of commercial networks that now stretched from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. Silk Road caravans passed through its territories, carrying goods whose value dwarfed anything previous generations had imagined, while new routes connecting the Black Sea ports with Mesopotamian markets channeled unprecedented wealth through local hands. Highland merchants proved remarkably adept at exploiting these new opportunities. Their caravans appeared in markets from Babylon to Byzantium, while local commercial houses established permanent outposts in major trading centers throughout the known world. The wealth generated by this expanded commerce provided local rulers with resources that enabled them to maintain self-rule, despite the theoretical claims of more formidable neighbors. The gradual weakening of Seleucid authority during the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC created space for more assertive local policies. As internal rebellions and external wars consumed Seleucid attention, mountain monarchs began expanding their territories beyond the traditional highland boundaries. The fertile plains of Mesopotamia beckoned to the south, while the prosperous cities of Anatolia offered tempting prizes to the west. Artaxias I emerged during this period of opportunity as the most significant leader since the realm's founding. Originally appointed as a Seleucid satrap governing the mountain territories, he possessed intimate knowledge of both Seleucid bureaucratic methods and their martial weaknesses. When the chaos following Antiochus III's defeat by Rome created opportunities for self-rule, Artaxias seized his moment with decisive brilliance. The revolt that established Artaxiad autonomy succeeded because it combined careful timing with visionary leadership. Artaxias waited until Seleucid forces were fully committed to defending their western territories against Roman pressure before declaring his independence. By the time Seleucid attention could focus on mountain affairs, Artaxias had already consolidated his grip over the highland territories, while establishing diplomatic relationships with Rome's other enemies, who were eager to support any challenge to Seleucid authority. The governmental system that Artaxias established provided the foundation for all future greatness. Drawing on the best elements of Persian, Seleucid, and native traditions, he created bureaucratic structures capable of managing territories far larger than any previous mountain realm had controlled. The combination of centralized martial authority with decentralized civil management enabled efficient coordination while preserving the local autonomy that highland peoples demanded. Artaxias understood that lasting self-rule required more than successful rebellion. It demanded the creation of structures capable of surviving the inevitable challenges that would follow. The legal code he promulgated established uniform standards throughout his territories while respecting local customs and traditions. The taxation system he implemented generated sufficient revenues to maintain professional forces without imposing burdens so heavy as to provoke regional resistance. The capital that Artaxias founded at Artashat represented his vision of local potential in physical form. Located at the confluence of the Araxes and Metsamor rivers, the city commanded vital caravan routes while enjoying natural defensive advantages that would make it extremely difficult for enemies to capture. The urban planning that guided Artashat's development incorporated the latest Hellenistic techniques while adapting them to local needs and preferences. Artashat quickly grew into one of the most important commercial centers in the entire region. Its markets attracted merchants from every corner of the known world, while its workshops produced luxury goods that commanded premium prices in distant markets. The wealth that flowed through Artashat's gates provided the economic foundation that would enable the realm to punch far above its demographic weight in the political struggles of the coming centuries. The martial reforms that Artaxias implemented transformed local defensive capabilities while preparing the ground for future expansion. The traditional reliance on feudal levies was supplemented by professional units modeled on Hellenistic practices, but adapted to mountain warfare conditions. The famous cavalry, bred from the finest horses the mountain pastures could produce, became renowned throughout the ancient world for their speed, endurance, and the skill of their riders. Local metallurgy during this period achieved levels of sophistication that rivaled the greatest centers of the ancient world. The iron deposits of the mountains provided raw materials, while techniques learned from Greek smiths and Persian craftsmen were refined to create weapons and armor of exceptional quality. Mountain steel became a commodity in its own right, sought after by warriors and collectors from Spain to India. The cultural synthesis that emerged under Artaxiad rule created a distinctively local identity that could absorb foreign influences without losing its essential character. Greek artistic techniques were employed to create sculptures and reliefs celebrating native themes, while Persian architectural elements were incorporated into buildings that remained unmistakably local in spirit. Most importantly, the native language was enriched with vocabulary borrowed from Greek, Persian, and Aramaic sources, while maintaining its Indo-European grammatical structure. Religious developments during the Artaxiad period laid foundations for the spiritual traditions that would sustain local identity through centuries of foreign domination. The ancient pantheon was systematically organized and rationalized, with Ahura Mazda emerging as the supreme deity presiding over a hierarchy of lesser gods and goddesses who governed various aspects of natural and human affairs. This theological structure provided both continuity with ancestral traditions and compatibility with the religious systems of neighboring peoples. The Persian Zoroastrian influence that permeated local religious thinking during this period would prove particularly significant for the realm's future development. The dualistic worldview that saw history as a cosmic struggle between forces of light and darkness appealed to a people whose geographic position constantly exposed them to conflicts between great dynasties. The emphasis on moral choice and divine judgment provided frameworks for understanding political challenges that would serve local leaders well in the difficult centuries ahead. Educational establishments created during Artaxias's reign ensured that future generations would possess the skills necessary to maintain and expand the realm he had created. Schools attached to temples and royal residences provided instruction in local, Greek, and Aramaic languages, while specialized training prepared young nobles for martial, bureaucratic, and diplomatic careers. The preservation of written records became a systematic practice that would enable later historians to reconstruct the achievements of this formative period. By the time of Artaxias's death, around 160 BC, the mountain realm had been transformed from a collection of highland tribes into a sophisticated polity capable of competing with any force in the region. The structures he had created, the territories he had conquered, and the diplomatic relationships he had established provided his successors with tools for achieving greatness that would have been unimaginable to earlier generations of local leaders. The succession that followed Artaxias's death revealed both the strengths and the potential weaknesses of the system he had created. The crown passed to his son, Artavasdes I, who inherited not only his father's territories, but also the challenges that came with ruling a realm positioned between the expanding forces of Rome and Parthia. The new monarch would soon discover that the self-rule his father had won could only be maintained through constant vigilance and extraordinary diplomatic skill. Artavasdes I faced immediate pressure from the Seleucid dynasty, which had never fully accepted the loss of mountain territories and sought to exploit any sign of weakness following the founder's death. Simultaneously, the rising dominion of Parthia to the east represented a new and potentially more dangerous threat to local autonomy. The Arsacid dynasty that had established oversight over much of the former Persian territories possessed both the martial capabilities and the visionary leadership necessary to challenge mountain self-rule. The diplomatic balancing act that Artavasdes I performed during his reign established patterns that would govern local foreign policy for generations, neither fully aligning with Rome against Parthia, nor completely submitting to Parthian authority against Rome. The realm maintained its autonomy by playing these great dynasties against each other, while building its own strength for the moment when more decisive action would become possible. The Parthian court at Ctesiphon became increasingly important in local calculations as Arsacid dominion solidified throughout the former Persian territories. The Parthian monarchs, claiming to be the legitimate heirs of the Achaemenid legacy, viewed mountain autonomy as a temporary anomaly that would eventually be corrected through either diplomatic pressure or martial action. Their ability to field armies of unprecedented size, supported by seemingly unlimited resources from their vast territories, gave weight to these ambitions. Yet the Parthians also recognized that the realm's position made it a valuable ally rather than merely a target for conquest. The mountain territory's management of vital caravan routes between Europe and Asia meant that Parthian commercial interests could be significantly enhanced through local cooperation. More importantly, the realm's martial capabilities, though smaller than Parthia's, were of sufficiently high quality to make conquest expensive and potentially counterproductive. The solution that emerged from these mutual recognitions established the framework within which local Parthian relations would operate for the next century. The mountain realm would acknowledge Parthian supremacy in ceremonial terms, while maintaining practical autonomy in internal affairs. Local princes would be educated at the Parthian court, ensuring their familiarity with Arsacid methods and their personal loyalty to Parthian interests, while mountain forces would support Parthian objectives in conflicts with mutual enemies. This arrangement culminated in the most significant event of Artavasdes III's reign, the delivery of his young son to the Parthian court as both hostage and student. The prince, who would one day become Tigranes the Great, began his education in the sophisticated environment of Ctesiphon, where he would spend the next 2 decades learning the arts of war and diplomacy from masters who ruled the largest realm on earth. The young Tigranes, who entered the Parthian court around 120 BC, carried with him the accumulated traditions and ambitions of his people. In his veins flowed the blood of mountain monarchs who had defended their freedom against every dynasty that had sought to subdue them. In his mind burned the vision of greatness that his ancestors had glimpsed but never fully realized. The education he would receive in Parthian palaces, the skills he would master in Arsacid schools of war and statecraft, and the relationships he would forge with the rulers of the ancient world would provide him with tools for achieving ambitions that would transform not only his homeland, but the entire balance of forces throughout the Near East. The stage was set for the emergence of a leader whose vision and capabilities would elevate the mountain realm from regional polity to imperial dominion. The structures created by Artaxius I, the diplomatic foundations laid by Artavasdes I, and the opportunities created by the growing rivalry between Rome and Parthia would provide the young prince with unprecedented possibilities for greatness. When Tigranes finally returned to claim his heritage, he would bring with him knowledge and ambitions that would reshape the ancient world. The ancient land of mountains, repository of Urartian wisdom and Artaxiad achievement, waited for its greatest son to return from his eastern education. In the palaces of Artashat, in the workshops of skilled craftsmen, in the training grounds where cavalry practiced their deadly arts, in the minds of nobles who remembered the glories of the past and dreamed of future triumphs, the elements of dominion lay ready for the hand that could forge them into instruments of conquest. The greatest chapter in this people's history was about to begin. Bronze gates of Ctesiphon swung open on a crisp morning in 95 BC, and from their shadows emerged a prince transformed by 2 decades of exile into something his homeland had never seen before. Walking through those gates, the returning heir carried more than just his freedom. He bore within his mind the accumulated wisdom of Arsacid warfare, Persian statecraft's diplomatic sophistication, and ambitions that would reshape the ancient world. 20 years of captivity had ended, but they had forged a master of arts that his mountain ancestors had never imagined. Parthian academies had provided education beyond anything received by previous rulers of his line. Revolutionary tactics of heavy cavalry warfare that had shattered Roman legions and conquered half of Asia became second nature to him. In war councils alongside Mithridates II, he observed how continental empires were organized, how distant provinces were governed, how diverse peoples could be welded into unified instruments of power. Most crucially, he learned that true sovereignty required not merely defensive strength, but the capacity to project force across vast distances. 3 weeks passed during his journey from Ctesiphon to Artashat, each day bringing him closer to a destiny shaped by every lesson learned during his eastern sojourn. Parthian nobles escorted him to witness his coronation and report back to their sovereign on the character of their new vassal. Yet as familiar peaks of his homeland rose before him, visions extended far beyond the ceremonial submission these witnesses expected to observe. Artashat had grown during his absence into a prosperous center, whose markets buzzed with merchants from across the known world. Greek craftsmen, Jewish traders, Persian artisans, and Mesopotamian bankers had transformed the capital into a cosmopolitan hub, rivaling any in the region. Prosperity filled every quarter, yet the returning king saw not an endpoint, but a foundation for achievements that would eclipse anything his predecessors had attempted. Coronation ceremonies that confirmed his ascension combined ancient traditions with innovations hinting at revolutionary changes to come. Sacred fire of Ahura Mazda burned before assembled nobles as he received the crown his ancestors had worn for 2 centuries. But his oath spoke not only of defending traditional boundaries, but of extending righteous dominion over all peoples who awaited liberation from chaos and oppression. First months on the throne were devoted to understanding the full extent of available resources for the grand design already taking shape. Treasury reserves accumulated through decades of careful trade management contained substantial wealth, though nothing approaching what continental campaigns would require. Feudal levies could provide perhaps 20,000 seasoned fighters, respectable for regional conflicts but inadequate for universal dominion. Most importantly, existing governmental structures, though sophisticated by local standards, lacked the complexity necessary for managing domains beyond traditional boundaries. Revolutionary transformation addressed every limitation that had constrained previous rulers. Reforms drew heavily on Arsacid innovations, while adapting them to specific advantages his homeland could provide. Famous horses of the mountain pastures, bred for centuries to thrive in high-altitude conditions, proved ideal for heavy cavalry tactics that had become the dominant force in Eastern warfare. Under Persian masters brought from Ctesiphon, young nobles learned to fight as cataphracts, armored horsemen whose disciplined charges could shatter any infantry formation. These mounted units represented a complete departure from traditional warfare methods that had relied primarily on defensive tactics suited to mountain terrain. New formations were designed for offensive ventures across varied landscapes, capable of rapid movement that could bring overwhelming strength to bear at decisive points while maintaining the mobility necessary to avoid enemies seeking to exploit superior numbers through attrition. Breeding programs established to support mounted warfare required systematic attention to bloodlines, pasturage, and training never attempted on such scale. Mares selected for speed and endurance were bred with stallions chosen for strength and temperament, while resulting offspring underwent regimens that produced mounts capable of carrying armored riders for hundreds of kilometers without exhaustion. Investment in horseflesh alone consumed wealth equivalent to building several new cities. Infantry development proceeded along parallel lines, incorporating lessons learned from observing Arsacid's successes and failures in their wars with Rome. Traditional mountain fighters were supplemented by professional units trained according to Persian discipline, but equipped with weapons and armor, produced in workshops that had mastered the finest metallurgical techniques available. Composite bows that equipped these new formations could penetrate Roman mail at ranges that rendered traditional siege equipment obsolete. Most innovative were engineering corps established to support extended ventures beyond the homeland's natural defenses. These specialized units combined traditional skills in mountain fortification with techniques learned from Persian siege masters and Hellenistic engineers. Their capabilities extended beyond simple assault work to include rapid construction of bridges, roads, and supply depots that would enable action across distances previously considered impossible. Governmental revolution accompanied these martial innovations, creating capabilities surpassing anything achieved by previous mountain dynasties. Drawing on Persian models but adapting them to local conditions and ambitions, new bureaucratic structures were designed from the beginning to manage domains spanning multiple cultural regions. Professional administrators replaced traditional appointees drawn from noble families, while standardized procedures ensured uniform implementation of royal policies regardless of local variations. Revenue collection systems were systematized according to principles that maximized both efficiency and growth potential, rather than relying on traditional tribute arrangements that had characterized relations between center and regional lords. New methods assessed productivity directly and encouraged economic development that would benefit both local populations and the central treasury. Commercial activities that had previously been lightly taxed became significant sources of income through carefully calibrated policies that enhanced rather than discouraged trade. Sophene offered the first major test of these transformed capabilities. This neighboring principality, ruled by a rival branch of the royal family, controlled strategic lands that commanded approaches to both Mesopotamia and Anatolia. Previous rulers had attempted to incorporate Sophene through marriage alliances and diplomatic pressure, but direct action would eliminate any future challenges while doubling available wealth and manpower. Initial diplomatic overtures offered Sophene's ruler generous terms for peaceful submission. When these negotiations predictably failed, subsequent action unfolded with precision that shocked contemporary observers. Rather than prolonged siege warfare that had characterized previous conflicts in the region, rapid maneuver tactics isolated enemy strongholds while systematically destroying their economic foundations. Decisive engagement at Carcathio-Sirta demonstrated the effectiveness of combined arms tactics that integrated heavy cavalry, professional infantry, and specialized engineering units. Sophene's fighters, though brave and familiar with local terrain, found themselves facing enemies whose coordination and equipment represented developments they had no means of countering. Battle lasted less than a day, but its outcome determined the future of both principalities. Treatment of conquered Sophene revealed sophisticated approaches to integration that would characterize all future acquisitions. Rather than simply plundering defeated lands, policies were implemented to transform former enemies into productive components of an expanding state. Nobility who submitted were incorporated into court, with honors that acknowledged their traditional status, while ensuring loyalty through practical self-interest. Common populations experienced changes that improved their conditions while serving broader strategic objectives. Agricultural settlements were reorganized according to methods that increased productivity while supporting larger numbers of inhabitants. Commercial activities were encouraged through infrastructure investments and protective policies that created incentives for cooperation with the new regime. Most importantly, cultural traditions that defined local identity were preserved and respected, while political authority was transferred to the expanding state. Integration policies required wealth and sophistication that previous mountain rulers had never possessed. Establishment of new governmental offices, training of additional administrators, and construction of facilities necessary for effective oversight consumed substantial portions of gains achieved through victory. Yet long-term thinking demanded investments in capabilities rather than simple extraction of immediate profits. Success in Sofien provided both practical experience and psychological momentum for more ambitious ventures. Eastern lands of Atropatene beckoned as logical targets, offering access to wealth and strategic positions that would dramatically enhance overall strength. These Iranian provinces, nominally subject to Arsacid oversight, but practically autonomous under local dynasts, controlled mountain passes and agricultural regions whose incorporation would establish secure eastern frontiers. Atropatene ventures required diplomatic preparation more complex than anything previously attempted. Status as a former ward of the Arsacid court created both opportunities and constraints that had to be carefully managed. Direct confrontation with Parthian armies remained unthinkable given the disparity in available strength, but fluid nature of Arsacid authority over distant provinces created possibilities that could be presented as internal reorganization rather than territorial aggression. Alliance negotiations that preceded active intervention demonstrated mastery of diplomatic arts learned during Eastern education. Local dynasts who controlled Atropatene lands were offered terms that emphasized mutual benefit and cultural compatibility rather than simple submission to superior force. Shared Zoroastrian religious traditions provided frameworks for cooperation that transcended immediate political considerations, while commercial agreements offered economic advantages that made collaboration more attractive than resistance. When action became necessary, it unfolded according to patterns that were becoming characteristic of operational methods. Rapid movement concentrated overwhelming strength at decisive points, while diplomatic efforts ensured that each engagement remained isolated from broader conflicts that might draw unwanted attention from major powers. Engineering capabilities that supported these ventures enabled construction of supply lines and fortifications that consolidated gains as rapidly as they were achieved. Victory and Media Atropatene brought domains to their first natural boundaries since growth began. Mountain ranges that separated these eastern acquisitions from the Arsacid heartland provided defensible frontiers that could be maintained without the constant vigilance required for less secure borders. More importantly, wealth and population gained through these actions provided foundations for ventures that would transform regional balances entirely. Dominion over Caucasus passages that connected European and Asian trade networks generated revenues that revolutionized state finances. Caravans carrying silk from China, spices from India, and precious metals from Central Asian mines passed through lands now subject to royal authority. Taxes and protective fees collected from this commerce provided steady income streams that reduced dependence on agricultural production, while funding establishments of unprecedented scope. Population transfers that accompanied Eastern growth represented the first systematic implementation of demographic policies that would become central to imperial strategy. Rather than leaving conquered lands under traditional leadership arrangements that might facilitate future rebellion, Substantial numbers of inhabitants were relocated to regions where their skills would serve broader objectives, while their political loyalties would focus on the expanding state rather than ancestral ties. Relocated populations brought expertise in metallurgy, agriculture, and crafts that enhanced productive capabilities throughout royal domains. Persian artisans established workshops that produced luxury goods for both domestic consumption and international trade, while agricultural specialists introduced techniques that increased crop yields in previously marginal lands. Most importantly, mixing of populations from different regions created cosmopolitan communities whose prosperity depended on continued state unity rather than regional autonomy. Diplomatic revolution that followed these early successes established the returning king as a major player in regional politics for the first time since his dynasty's founding. Embassies from distant courts began arriving in Artashat, seeking alliance, trade agreements, and cooperation against mutual enemies. Transformation from regional principality to significant power had been achieved with remarkable speed, but it also created new challenges that would test every capability developed during the growth process. Relations with Parthia required particularly delicate management as growing strength began to rival former protectors' regional interests. Our Sassanid court had originally supported his return to power, expecting to gain a reliable vassal whose capabilities would serve broader objectives. Instead, they found themselves dealing with an independent ruler whose ambitions extended far beyond traditional boundaries, and whose wealth increasingly enabled pursuit of those ambitions. Solutions that emerged from this evolving relationship reflected sophisticated calculations that both courts brought to their negotiations. Ceremonial acknowledgement of our Sassanid supremacy would continue while practical policies served royal interests. Parthian support would be available for ventures that aligned with their strategic objectives, while conflicts of interest would be managed through careful consultation rather than direct confrontation. These arrangements enabled pursuit of Western opportunities that had been developing since Eastern consolidation was completed. Weakening Seleucid authority in Syria and growing Roman involvement in Anatolian affairs created instabilities that offered possibilities for dramatic territorial gains. More importantly, intervention in these Western conflicts would bring contact with Mithridates VI of Pontus, whose own ambitions would complement and enhance the imperial vision that was now driving all aspects of state policy. By 85 BSC, transformation of royal domains had reached the point where further growth required qualitatively different approaches to both action and political organization. Regional principality that had existed a decade earlier had been replaced by a multi-ethnic state whose lands stretched from the Caucasus to the Zagros Mountains. Structures, capabilities, and economic foundations assembled during this remarkable decade would soon be tested in conflicts whose scope and consequences would reshape the ancient world. Greater Armenia was emerging as a force capable of challenging the greatest powers of the age. Ancestral inheritance had been transformed into the foundation for an empire that would rival Rome and Parthia themselves. Coming phases would determine whether capabilities so carefully assembled could achieve the universal dominion that was now within reach of this strengthened and expanded realm. Across the wine-dark waters of the Black Sea, a messenger ship cut through autumn swells, carrying letters that would forge the most dangerous alliance the ancient world had ever witnessed. In his palace at Sinope, Mithridates VI of Pontus read proposals that perfectly aligned with his own burning ambitions for revenge against Rome. Meanwhile, in Artashat's marble halls, Tigranes studied maps that showed how two kings working in concert could reshape the balance of power from the Atlantic to the Indus River. Both monarchs had suffered under Roman arrogance, Both commanded armies capable of challenging legionary might, and both possessed the vision necessary to transform their separate realms into a unified force that could drive the Romans back to their Italian peninsula. Mithridates brought to this partnership his mastery of naval warfare, his extensive spy networks throughout the Greek settlements, and his personal hatred of everything Roman. Tigranes offered the finest heavy cavalry in the world, vast financial resources generated by controlling Asian trade routes, and strategic depth that could absorb any Roman counterstrike. Letters exchanged between the two courts revealed careful planning that extended far beyond simple cooperation. Marriage alliances would cement political bonds, with Mithridates offering his daughter Cleopatra as bride to the Armenian king. Commercial agreements would integrate their economies, creating financial strength that could sustain prolonged warfare against Rome's seemingly inexhaustible treasury. Most importantly, coordinated timing would ensure that Roman forces faced simultaneous pressure from multiple directions, preventing them from concentrating their legendary organizational advantages against either partner individually. Pontus had already demonstrated what determined leadership could achieve against Roman expansion. Mithridates' earlier wars had shown that Greek settlements throughout Asia Minor would rally to any leader who promised liberation from Roman taxation and exploitation. His armies had proven capable of defeating Roman commanders who underestimated local fighting capabilities, while his diplomatic networks had revealed the extent of anti-Roman sentiment throughout the region. Armenian involvement transformed these regional conflicts into something approaching world war, where Mithridates alone might eventually be overwhelmed by Rome's superior resources and organizational capabilities. The combined strength of Pontus and Armenia represented a challenge that would test every aspect of Roman machinery. Together, they could field armies approaching 200,000 men, control territories spanning from the Black Sea to the Persian Gulf, and command financial resources rivaling those of Rome itself. Planning for coordinated action required months of careful preparation, as both realms adapted their structures for unprecedented ventures. Armenian forces were reorganized according to strategic objectives that extended far beyond traditional Highland warfare, while Pontic armies prepared for land campaigns that would complement their established naval superiority. Supply networks were established to support forces operating hundreds of miles from their home bases, while intelligence-gathering efforts mapped Roman deployments throughout the Mediterranean. Intelligence reports reaching both courts confirmed that Roman attention remained focused primarily on internal political struggles and Western expansion efforts. The social war had consumed Roman resources for several years, while continuing conflicts in Spain and Gaul kept veteran legions occupied far from the east. Most importantly, Roman commanders in Asia Minor had grown complacent after decades of managing what they considered pacified provinces, leaving their forces poorly positioned to respond to coordinated attacks from multiple directions. Winter planning sessions in both capitals finalized operational details that would transform the Mediterranean into a battlefield spanning 3 continents. Mithridates would begin with naval operations designed to isolate Roman forces in Asia Minor, while simultaneously encouraging Greek settlements to declare their independence. Armenian armies would strike south into Syria and Mesopotamia, eliminating Seleucid remnants while establishing advanced bases for further Western expansion. Precise timing would ensure that Roman response forces faced impossible choices between defending established positions and preventing further enemy advances. Spring of 83 BC witnessed the opening moves of campaigns that would reshape the ancient world. Pontic fleets appeared simultaneously off dozens of ports from Sinope to Rhodes, their unexpected coordination demonstrating the level of preparation that had preceded active hostilities. Greek settlements throughout Asia Minor declared their liberation from Roman rule while opening their gates to Mithridates' advancing armies. Within weeks, Roman control over territories they had governed for generations simply evaporated. Simultaneously, Armenian forces poured south through passes that previous invasions had never successfully defended. Damascus fell before its garrison could organize effective resistance, while Antioch's massive walls proved inadequate against siege techniques perfected during the Atropatene campaigns. Most shocking to contemporary observers was the speed with which these operations unfolded. Territories that Rome had assumed would require months to conquer were overrun in weeks. Seleucid resistance collapsed with stunning rapidity as the last representatives of Alexander's legacy discovered that their exhausted realm possessed neither the capabilities nor the popular support necessary to resist determined invaders. Urban centers that had endured centuries of civil war and foreign interference welcomed Armenian rule as liberation from chaos, rather as subjugation by foreigners. The governmental systems implemented by Tigranes' governors brought order and prosperity to regions that had known neither for generations. Incorporation of Syrian lands into the expanding Armenian realm demonstrated the sophisticated approaches to integration that had been refined through earlier acquisitions. Rather than imposing highland customs on Mediterranean populations, local practices were preserved and celebrated while political control was transferred to the new regime. Greek artistic techniques flourished under Armenian patronage, while commercial networks were expanded to serve broader objectives. Damascus became the western capital of what was rapidly becoming a transcontinental dominion. The ancient settlement's position at the crossroads of trade routes connecting Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Mediterranean made it an ideal center for managing newly acquired territories. Armenian engineers began construction projects that would transform Damascus into a worthy partner to Artashat, while merchants from throughout the known world established permanent operations in markets that now enjoyed protection from the strongest force in the region. Antioch's capture represented an even greater triumph, as this cosmopolitan metropolis had served as the Seleucid capital for over 2 centuries. The settlement's fall sent shockwaves throughout the Mediterranean world, demonstrating that Armenian power had reached a level capable of challenging the greatest centers of Hellenistic civilization. The wealth seized from Seleucid treasuries provided resources for further expansion, while the skilled bureaucrats found in royal archives were incorporated into the growing governmental structure. Religious policies implemented throughout these newly acquired territories revealed the theological sophistication that underlay Armenian ideology. Rather than imposing Zoroastrian practices on diverse populations, local cults were incorporated into a syncretic framework that acknowledged the universal sovereignty of Ahura Mazda while respecting established forms of worship. This approach generated popular support that transformed potential rebellion into enthusiastic collaboration. From Damascus and Antioch, Armenian influence radiated throughout the region as local rulers calculated their responses to the new reality. The Hasmonean realm in Judea found itself caught between the expanding Armenian dominion to the north and continuing Roman influence to the west. Egypt's Ptolemaic rulers faced similar challenges as Armenian power extended towards spheres of influence that had been considered secure for centuries. Negotiations with smaller powers revealed the diplomatic sophistication that complemented Armenian capabilities. Rather than simply demanding submission from potential enemies, carefully crafted agreements offered benefits that made cooperation more attractive than resistance. Commercial privileges, protection from regional rivals, and guarantees of internal autonomy provided frameworks for voluntary association that reduced the commitments required for territorial control. These diplomatic successes enabled Armenian forces to penetrate even further south and west without encountering the unified resistance that might have developed if expansion had relied purely on intimidation. The Nabatean realm opened its trade routes to Armenian merchants while providing intelligence about Roman activities in the region. Jewish communities throughout the diaspora found in Armenian protection opportunities for commercial and religious development that had been constrained under previous regimes. Most dramatically, Armenian power reached the Mediterranean itself as Phoenician ports declared their association with the expanding dominion. These ancient centers of maritime commerce brought to the Armenian realm naval capabilities and commercial networks that had connected the Mediterranean world for over a millennium. The combination of Armenian land power with Phoenician naval expertise created strategic possibilities that neither had possessed independently. Tyre and Sidon, those legendary centers of purple dye production and maritime trade, became Armenian ports whose fleets could project power throughout the region. The shipyards that had built vessels for Egyptian pharaohs and Mesopotamian kings now constructed warships for Armenian admirals, while Phoenician merchants established trading posts throughout the Black Sea region under Armenian protection. This synthesis of highland and maritime cultures created capabilities that would influence Mediterranean politics for generations. Construction of Tigranes began during this period of unprecedented success, as the king sought to create a capital worthy of his expanding realm. The site chosen for this new metropolis lay in the fertile Armenian region, positioned to command trade routes connecting Armenia proper with the newly acquired southern territories. Unlike established Armenian settlements that had grown organically over centuries, Tigranes was planned from the beginning as the center of a universal dominion. Urban planning for this revolutionary settlement incorporated the finest architectural styles from every culture within the expanding realm. Persian garden techniques created paradises within the urban environment, while Greek theatre design enabled public entertainment on scales previously impossible. Mesopotamian irrigation methods supported populations far larger than the region had ever contained, while Egyptian architectural elements provided the monumental scale appropriate for a royal capital. Population transfers that supplied inhabitants for this new metropolis represented demographic engineering on an unprecedented scale. Royal inscriptions document the relocation of over 300,000 people from throughout the dominion, including Greek artisans from captured settlements, Jewish merchants from throughout the diaspora, and Persian craftsmen whose skills were essential for the luxury manufactures that would support court life. These transfers created the most cosmopolitan urban center the ancient world had ever witnessed. Workshops established in Tigranes produced goods that combined artistic styles from across the known world while serving the practical needs of governmental functions. Persian carpet weaving techniques were applied to Armenian wool to create textiles that became prized throughout the Mediterranean. Greek sculptors worked with Armenian marble to produce monumental art celebrating the king's achievements, while Mesopotamian jewelers created ceremonial objects incorporating precious stones from throughout the dominion. Cultural synthesis achieved in Tigranes extended far beyond simple artistic fusion to encompass intellectual and religious developments that would influence human thought for centuries. Libraries established in the new capital preserved texts from every literary heritage within the realm, while schools provided education in multiple languages and cultural systems. Most importantly, the theological discussions that flourished in this cosmopolitan environment began developing religious concepts that would eventually influence the emergence of monotheistic beliefs. Greek theatrical productions performed in Tigranocerta's magnificent amphitheatre drew audiences from throughout the realm, while adapting classical works to reflect Armenian themes. Tragedies celebrating the victories of Alexander the Great were rewritten to honor Tigranes' achievements, while comedies satirizing Roman pretensions provided entertainment that reinforced royal ideology. These cultural events served both artistic and political functions, creating shared experiences that transcended ethnic and linguistic differences among the Dominion's diverse populations. The declaration of Tigranes as King of Kings during elaborate ceremonies in the completed capital represented the culmination of a decade of unprecedented expansion. This ancient title, which had been borne by Persian emperors and Macedonian conquerors, proclaimed Armenian claims to universal sovereignty that extended far beyond regional boundaries. The coronation ceremonies themselves demonstrated the wealth, cultural sophistication, and international recognition that Armenian power had achieved. Representatives from throughout the known world witnessed these ceremonies, acknowledging through their presence the reality of Armenian status. Parthian nobles brought gifts that symbolized their recognition of Tigranes as an equal rather than a subordinate, while Greek settlements sent embassies that celebrated liberation from Roman domination. Even Celtic tribes from distant Gaul dispatched representatives who sought Armenian alliance against their Roman oppressors. Religious dimensions of these ceremonies revealed the theological foundations underlying Armenian ideology. The sacred fire of Ahura Mazda burned throughout the celebrations, while priests from every major religious heritage within the realm offered prayers for continued success. This syncretic approach demonstrated that Armenian rule represented not the domination of one culture over others, but the synthesis of human civilization under divine guidance. Governmental systems developed to govern this vast dominion incorporated the most sophisticated techniques available while adapting them to unprecedented challenges. The satrapy system, inherited from Persian heritage, was modified to accommodate ethnic and religious diversity that exceeded anything previous realms had attempted to manage. Regional governors were selected not only for their loyalty to the center, but for their understanding of local customs and their ability to implement royal policies in ways that respected cultural sensitivities. Communication networks linking territories required engineering achievements that rivaled the greatest construction projects of the ancient world. Royal roads connecting Tigranocerta with Damascus, Antioch, and Artashat enabled rapid transmission of orders and information across distances that had previously made effective oversight impossible. Relay stations positioned at regular intervals provided fresh horses and supplies for royal messengers, while serving as centers for local governance. Economic integration of such diverse territories created commercial opportunities that transformed trade patterns throughout the region. Armenian control of highland passes, regional ports, and Phoenician harbors meant that goods moving between Europe and Asia passed entirely through territories under unified rule. The elimination of intermediate taxation and the guarantee of safe passage encouraged commercial development that benefited both royal revenues and local prosperity. Naval capabilities developed through Phoenician association enabled Armenian influence to extend throughout the Mediterranean for the first time in the realm's history. Fleets based in Tyre and Sidon could project power to Cyprus, Crete, and even the Aegean Islands, while supporting land forces operating in coastal regions. This maritime dimension of Armenian power created strategic options that had been unavailable to previous highland realms, while generating revenues from sources that geographic location had previously made inaccessible. By 75 BC, the Armenian dominion had achieved a scope and sophistication that rivaled anything in human history. From the snow-capped peaks of the Caucasus to the sun-baked deserts of Arabia, from the trading ports of the Black Sea to the bustling markets of the Mediterranean. A single rule directed the affairs of dozens of peoples speaking scores of languages. The vision that had inspired Tigranes during his Parthian education had been realized beyond even his most ambitious dreams. Yet this unprecedented success had also generated challenges that would test every aspect of organization and leadership. The vast distances involved in governing such territories strained communication capabilities despite the sophisticated networks that had been established. Cultural diversity that enriched civilization also created opportunities for opposition movements that could exploit ethnic and religious differences. Most ominously, the expansion that had elevated Armenia to great power status had brought it into direct conflict with Rome at the very moment when Roman attention was beginning to focus seriously on affairs in the East. The stage was set for confrontations that would determine whether the greatest realm of the Orient could maintain its achievements against the greatest military machine of the West. Everything that Tigranes had built, the governmental systems, the capabilities, the economic foundations, and the cultural synthesis, would soon face the ultimate test of Roman determination to maintain their own supremacy. Dawn broke red over the 7 hills as senators gathered in the marble chambers of the Curia to debate a crisis that threatened Rome's very survival. For months, disturbing reports had arrived from the Orient, describing disasters that made even veteran lawmakers pale with disbelief. Entire provinces had vanished overnight. Loyal governors had been massacred, and Latin prestige lay trampled beneath the hooves of barbarian cavalry. Most shocking of all, these catastrophes stemmed not from familiar enemies like Parthia or Egypt, but from an obscure mountain king whose very name had been unknown to most citizens just years before. Marcus Crassus rose from his seat to address the hushed assembly, his voice carrying the urgency that had made him one of Rome's most effective speakers. Recent intelligence from surviving refugees painted a picture of coordinated destruction that surpassed anything in memory. The Pontic ruler had returned from exile more dangerous than ever, but this time he fought alongside an ally whose capabilities transformed regional rebellion into existential threat. This Highland upstart commanded resources that rivaled Rome itself, while possessing innovations that had already proven devastatingly effective against traditional legionary tactics. The general who would lead the response listened to these debates with the calculating mind of a commander who understood that words alone would never restore Latin dominance in the Orient. His earlier ventures against the Pontic ruler had demonstrated both the potential for victory and the challenges involved in fighting enemies who refused to engage in conventional warfare. The addition of Highland strength to Pontic resistance created complications that would require fundamental changes in strategy. Most crucially, success would demand rapid action before these allies could consolidate their gains into permanent advantage. Senate deliberations revealed the full scope of the crisis confronting Latin power. Asia Minor, that jewel of provinces whose taxes had funded expansion for generations, had been completely lost to the enemy. Syria, recently organized as a province after the collapse of Seleucid power, now acknowledged Highland sovereignty instead of Latin authority. Most ominously, reports suggested that anti-Latin sentiment was spreading throughout the Mediterranean, as previously loyal populations began calculating the benefits of alignment with these resurgent powers. Financial implications of these disasters threatened to undermine capabilities throughout the Mediterranean world. The loss of Asian tax revenues eliminated funding sources that had become essential for maintaining legions in Spain, Gaul, and other distant theatres. More immediately, the cost of reconquering lost territories would strain the treasury at precisely the moment when available resources were dramatically reduced. Victory in the Orient had become not merely a matter of prestige, but of fiscal survival. Strategic planning sessions in the Temple of Mars revealed the challenges that any recovery effort would face. Traditional advantages, disciplined infantry, superior logistics, and systematic siege warfare had proven inadequate against enemies who combined mobility with defensive strength in ways that neutralized legionary superiority. The disasters in Asia Minor demonstrated that conventional approaches would likely result in additional defeats that Rome could not afford to sustain. Solutions proposed by the designated commander reflected both his understanding of warfare in the Orient and his confidence in Latin adaptability. Rather than attempting to match enemy mobility through tactical modifications, legions would exploit their organizational advantages to create strategic conditions that forced enemies to fight on favorable terms. Systematic destruction of enemy economic foundations would eliminate the resources that sustained Highland and Pontic establishments, while diplomatic efforts would isolate these enemies from potential allies who might tip the balance decisively against Rome. Preparation for this venture required mobilization on a scale that tested every aspect of governmental machinery. Veteran legions were recalled from Spain and Gaul despite ongoing conflicts in those regions, while new units were raised through emergency recruitment that drew heavily on Italian allies whose loyalty had been secured through recent citizenship grants. Most importantly, financial arrangements were negotiated with business interests whose investments had been lost to enemy action and who were eager to fund recovery efforts. Reconnaissance efforts revealed both opportunities and dangers that would influence the conduct of coming actions. Highland expansion had been so rapid that governmental structures remained fragile in many newly acquired territories, creating possibilities for subversion that might facilitate reconquest efforts. However, the wealth that the Mountain King had accumulated through controlling Asian trade routes provided him with resources that could sustain prolonged resistance, even if initial advances proved successful. The Highland ruler's personality emerged from these reports as a crucial factor that might determine the outcome of the entire conflict. Unlike his Pontic ally, whose hatred of Rome was well established and whose commitment to continued warfare was unquestionable, the Mountain King appeared to be a pragmatic leader whose primary objectives involved expanding and consolidating his own power rather than destroying Rome itself. This suggested possibilities for diplomatic solutions that might detach the Highlands from the Pontic alliance while eliminating the most dangerous threat to Latin interests in the Orient. Spring of 74 BC witnessed the departure of the designated general, with legions that represented Rome's most serious commitment to warfare in the Orient for generations. 5 veteran formations formed the core of his army, supplemented by allied contingents and specialized units whose equipment had been modified based on lessons learned from earlier defeats. Most importantly, the baggage trains that followed these formations carried supplies for extended action that would not depend on living off the land in regions where enemy activity had made foraging impossible. Early actions focused on re-establishing Latin control over western Anatolia, while gathering information about enemy dispositions and capabilities. The systematic approach that the commander employed differed markedly from previous methods that had emphasized rapid advances toward decisive battles. Instead, each territory was methodically cleared of enemy presence, while infrastructure was rebuilt to support further advances. This patient methodology reflected understanding that lasting victory required restoration of governmental control rather than simple tactical success. The siege of Amissus demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of these new approaches. This key Black Sea port had become a major base for Pontic naval activities, that threatened supply lines throughout the region. Traditional assault techniques proved inadequate against fortifications that had been strengthened using Highland engineering methods, while the city's position enabled defenders to receive supplies and reinforcements despite efforts to impose a complete blockade. 7 months of continuous effort were required before Amisus finally fell to attacking legions, but the victory's strategic implications extended far beyond the immediate tactical success. Control of this port enabled fleets to operate throughout the Black Sea, while cutting crucial supply lines that had connected Pontic and Highland armies. More importantly, the systematic methods employed during the siege provided templates for future actions against similarly fortified positions. Information gathered during the Amisus action revealed the sophisticated nature of enemy preparations for continued resistance. Highland engineers had been systematically strengthening fortifications throughout Pontus, using techniques that combined traditional methods with innovations developed during recent ventures. Supply networks had been established that could sustain these strengthened positions, even under prolonged siege conditions, while communication systems enabled coordinated responses to advancing legions. The pursuit of the Pontic ruler into the interior tested Latin adaptability against enemies who refused to engage in conventional warfare. Enemy cavalry, reinforced by Highland contingents, employed hit-and-run tactics that inflicted steady casualties while avoiding decisive engagements that might favor organizational advantages. The mountainous terrain that characterized much of Pontus provided natural defensive positions that channeled advances into predictable patterns while offering numerous opportunities for ambush. Logistics faced unprecedented challenges in supporting action across such difficult terrain against enemies who systematically destroyed anything that might be useful to advancing legions. Traditional methods of supply through established bases became impossible when bases themselves were subject to constant attack, while foraging proved ineffective in regions that had been deliberately devastated. The solutions that the commander developed required innovations in organization and technique that would influence practice for generations. Reports arriving from Syria during this period revealed that Highland armies were withdrawing from some advanced positions while consolidating their control over core territories. This strategic retreat suggested that the Mountain King was responding to pressure by adopting defensive strategies that would make reconquest more difficult while preserving his most valuable acquisitions. The implications of this shift required careful analysis to determine whether it represented genuine weakness or calculated repositioning for continued resistance. Diplomatic initiatives launched during this period sought to exploit apparent cracks in the alliance, while offering alternatives to continued warfare. Messages sent to the Highland ruler emphasized the benefits of accommodation with Rome, while warning of the consequences that would follow continued association with his Pontic ally. These overtures deliberately avoided ultimatums that might force the Mountain King into positions from which retreat would be impossible, instead offering face-saving compromises that might appeal to his pragmatic instincts. The response to these diplomatic initiatives revealed the complexity of Highland decision-making processes that reflected both domestic constraints and international obligations. While the king appeared personally inclined toward accommodation that would preserve his core territories, powerful factions within his court advocated continued resistance based on confidence in their capabilities and skepticism about Latin willingness to honor negotiated agreements. The influence of his Pontic ally, both as partner and as father-in-law, complicated these internal debates in ways that made prediction of policy extremely difficult. Preparations that characterized the final months of 71 BC reflected the commander's determination to force decisive action before diplomatic uncertainty could undermine strategic position. The systematic approach that had characterized earlier actions was accelerated to capitalize on enemy weaknesses that reconnaissance suggested were becoming more pronounced. Most importantly, preparations began for ventures that would carry legions beyond traditional boundaries into the heart of Highland territory itself. The strategic decision to invade the mountain realm proper represented a fundamental departure from previous policy that had typically sought to control territories through client relationships rather than direct occupation. The unique circumstances created by Highland expansion required responses that acknowledged the impossibility of traditional solutions, while accepting the risks involved in more aggressive approaches. Success would require not merely defeating enemy armies, but demonstrating capability to project power across distances that had previously been considered prohibitive. Information gathered through extensive reconnaissance revealed both the opportunities and the challenges that Highland invasion would present. The realm's rapid expansion had created internal tensions that might be exploited through careful political warfare, while the wealth concentrated in centers like the new capital offered rewards that could justify the enormous costs involved in such distant ventures. However, the logistical challenges of maintaining legions in such remote regions, combined with the defensive advantages that geography provided to Highland defenders, created risks that could result in disasters surpassing even recent defeats. Psychological warfare became an increasingly important component of strategy as the commander sought to undermine enemy morale while building support for continued action among his own legions. Stories of Highland wealth and the glory that would come from conquering such a distant enemy were carefully cultivated to maintain fighting spirit despite the hardships of prolonged effort. Simultaneously, attempts were made to spread uncertainty within Highland territories about their king's ability to protect them from Latin vengeance. The winter of 70 to 69 BC witnessed final preparations for action that would determine the future of power in the Orient. Supply bases were established as far forward as conditions permitted, while specialized equipment was manufactured for ventures in terrain and climate that differed dramatically from previous experience. Most crucially, reconnaissance networks were expanded to provide the detailed information about enemy dispositions and capabilities that would be essential for success in such challenging circumstances. As spring approached, both armies prepared for efforts that would test everything they had learned during years of warfare. Latin confidence rested on organizational superiority and systematic methods that had gradually restored their position despite initial disasters. Highland strength lay in defensive advantages and the wealth that could sustain prolonged resistance even under the most adverse conditions. The approaching battles would determine not merely the fate of individual efforts, but the future balance of power throughout the ancient world. The stage was set for confrontations that would reveal whether Latin persistence could overcome Highland innovation, whether traditional methods could adapt to unprecedented challenges, and whether the greatest machine in the Western world could prevail against the most successful conquest state that the Orient had produced. Everything that both sides had built during years of preparation would soon be tested in battles whose outcomes would echo through history. Thunder rolled across the marble halls of the Senate as news arrived that would transform the Oriental crisis from manageable problem into catastrophic disaster. Lucullus, the methodical general who had spent 3 years carefully rebuilding strength in Asia Minor, now faced a mutiny that threatened to destroy everything he had accomplished. His legions, exhausted by years of campaigning in hostile territory and frustrated by the systematic approach that had delayed decisive action, refused to advance further into the mountain realm that still harbored their most dangerous enemies. The great rose from his seat with the confident bearing of a man who had never known defeat in any theatre where Rome had sent him to fight. At 37, he already commanded a reputation that surpassed generals twice his age, having crushed Sertorius in Spain and eliminated the pirate menace that had terrorized Mediterranean commerce for decades. His supporters argued that only a commander of his proven capabilities could salvage the deteriorating situation in the Orient while restoring the prestige that recent setbacks had cost the Republic. Debate raged through the autumn months of 67 BC as competing factions within the Senate argued over the wisdom of replacing a competent, if methodical, general with a younger commander whose very success made him potentially dangerous to Republican institutions. Cato the Younger led opposition to the proposal, warning that granting such extensive authority to any individual risked transforming temporary emergency powers into permanent autocracy. Yet the practical arguments for decisive action gradually overcame theoretical concerns about constitutional precedent. The lex Manilia that granted the young commander unprecedented authority over all affairs in the Orient passed despite fierce opposition from conservative senators who understood the long-term implications of such concentration of power. The new leader received control over armies, fleets, treasuries, and diplomatic relationships throughout the region, while his appointment carried no specified time limit that might constrain his freedom of action. For the first time in its history, the Republic had essentially granted one-man command over territories spanning multiple continents. Strategic assessment of the situation differed fundamentally from his predecessor's methodical approach, where Lucullus had sought to rebuild strength gradually through systematic reduction of enemy capabilities. The new commander envisioned rapid strikes designed to eliminate key enemies before they could adapt to changing circumstances. Most importantly, he understood that psychological impact often mattered more than tactical victories in wars involving such vast distances and diverse populations. Intelligence networks inherited from his predecessor provided detailed information about enemy dispositions that revealed both opportunities and constraints affecting any new strategy. The Mountain King had consolidated his remaining territories around naturally defensible positions that would require enormous resources to reduce through conventional siege warfare. However, this defensive concentration had also isolated him from potential allies, while creating supply vulnerabilities that rapid movement might exploit decisively. The winter planning session conducted at headquarters in Ephesus brought together the finest specialists available for warfare in the Orient. Engineers who had served in earlier campaigns provided expertise about terrain and climate conditions, while intelligence officers briefed the new commander on enemy capabilities and potential political weaknesses. Most crucially, diplomatic specialists outlined opportunities for detaching the mountain realm from its Pontic alliance through negotiations that might avoid the enormous costs of continued action. Reconnaissance efforts launched during the early months of 66 BC revealed that recent setbacks had significantly weakened enemy positions throughout the region. The Pontic ruler's flight into the distant Caucasus had eliminated effective coordination between allied armies, while internal tensions within the mountain realm suggested that popular support for continued warfare was declining. Most importantly, financial pressures created by years of conflict had strained both realms' ability to maintain the large armies that had initially made them so formidable. Diplomatic initiatives that preceded active operations demonstrated sophisticated understanding of political dynamics in the Orient, rather than simply demanding unconditional surrender from the Mountain King. Carefully crafted proposals offered terms that would preserve royal dignity while acknowledging Roman supremacy in broader regional affairs. These negotiations emphasized mutual benefits that could be achieved through cooperation, while subtly indicating the consequences that might follow continued resistance. The response from the royal court revealed the complex calculations that now influenced policy. 3 years of warfare had demonstrated both the capabilities and the limitations of Roman power, while internal pressures from nobles who had suffered losses during the conflict created powerful incentives for accommodation. Most significantly, the isolation that had resulted from his allies' flight had left the Mountain King facing the full weight of enemy pressure, without the support that had initially made resistance seem feasible. Letters exchanged between the two commanders during the spring of 66 BN, preserved in later archives, reveal the delicate negotiations that would determine the fate of the largest realm in the Orient. Correspondence carefully balanced respect for royal dignity with firm insistence on practical concessions that would restore Roman interests throughout the region. The Mountain King's responses demonstrated both his understanding of realities and his desire to preserve as much as possible of the empire he had spent decades building. The dramatic meeting that took place outside the royal capital represented one of the most significant diplomatic encounters in ancient history. Contemporary accounts describe how the King of Kings, whose armies had terrorized the Orient for a generation, approached the Roman commander's camp wearing simple traveling clothes, rather than the elaborate regalia that had become associated with his claims to universal dominion. The symbolic power of this gesture resonated throughout the ancient world, as evidence that even the mightiest potentates acknowledged Roman supremacy. Negotiations conducted within the elaborate pavilion lasted 3 days, while representatives from throughout the region waited to learn whether diplomacy could achieve what years of warfare had failed to accomplish. The Mountain King's willingness to engage in direct talks demonstrated his recognition that continued resistance would likely result in the complete destruction of everything he had built, while careful attention to ceremonial details showed understanding that rulers in the Orient required face-saving arrangements that preserved their dignity even in defeat. The treaty terms that emerged from these negotiations reflected the complex balance between practical necessities and political requirements that characterized successful ancient diplomacy. The mountain realm would retain its traditional boundaries while abandoning all territories acquired during the recent expansion that had triggered the current conflict. Tribute payments would acknowledge Roman supremacy while remaining modest enough to avoid crippling economic recovery. Most importantly, royal succession would require Roman approval, ensuring that future rulers would maintain policies compatible with broader regional stability. Financial arrangements specified in the treaty revealed the enormous wealth that expansion had accumulated over the previous decade. The 6,000 talents demanded as immediate tribute represented approximately 10% of Rome's annual revenues, demonstrating both the prosperity that had funded conquests and the resources now available for reconstruction efforts. Additional payments would continue annually at rates calculated to maintain loyalty without encouraging rebellion through excessive burdens. Clauses of the agreement eliminated the mountain realm as a potential threat to Roman interests while preserving sufficient strength for regional stability. The professional armies that had conquered half of Asia would be disbanded, except for traditional guard units responsible for internal security. Fortifications built during the recent expansion would be dismantled, while those protecting traditional territories could be maintained. Most significantly, capabilities would be permanently limited to levels appropriate for a client state rather than an independent power. The ceremony that confirmed these arrangements demonstrated genius for psychological warfare that complemented tactical capabilities. The King of Kings formally removed his crown and placed it on the ground before the Roman commander, acknowledging through this ancient gesture that his authority derived from foreign grant rather than independent right. When the crown was immediately returned while embracing the ruler as an ally and friend, the message conveyed to watching representatives was unmistakable. Resistance led to humiliation, but cooperation brought honor and security. Territorial redistributions that followed the treaty's implementation reshaped the political geography of the entire region in ways that would influence development for centuries. Syria was organized as a Roman province under direct governmental control, while smaller realms that had survived the recent conflicts received territorial adjustments that reflected their cooperation or resistance during the crisis. Most importantly, the settlement established clear boundaries and relationships that reduced opportunities for future conflicts while creating incentives for regional stability. Administrative arrangements for governing the newly pacified territories revealed the sophisticated understanding of management that had been developed through experiences in multiple theaters. Rather than imposing uniform systems that might generate resistance from diverse populations, flexible approaches acknowledged local traditions while ensuring effective oversight of essential functions. Regional governors selected for their understanding of customs would implement policies designed to encourage prosperity while maintaining security. Economic policies implemented throughout the region aimed to restore the commercial prosperity that had made these territories valuable, while ensuring that future development would serve broader Roman interests. Trade routes that had been disrupted by years of warfare were reopened under protective arrangements that encouraged merchants to resume activities. Harbour facilities and road networks damaged during the conflict received priority attention for reconstruction efforts, funded through tribute payments and war reparations. The collapse of Pontic resistance that followed the mountain realm's submission demonstrated how completely the strategic situation had been transformed. Deprived of his most important ally and facing the combined pressure of cooperation with Roman forces, the Pontic ruler found his remaining supporters abandoning resistance efforts that no longer seemed sustainable. Within months, his flight to distant refuges eliminated the last major threat to Roman dominance throughout the region. Cultural dimensions of the settlement revealed understanding that lasting peace required more than victory or diplomatic agreements. Educational exchanges would bring young nobles to Rome for training, while Roman scholars would establish schools in major centers throughout the Orient. Religious arrangements would respect local traditions while encouraging participation in ceremonies that reinforced political relationships. Most importantly, intermarriage between families would create personal bonds that transcended purely political connections. The systematic nature of these arrangements reflected lessons learned from previous settlements that had failed to create lasting stability. Rather than relying primarily on deterrence or economic incentives, the new framework created multiple layers of connection that made rebellion both difficult and counterproductive. Prosperity would depend on continued cooperation, while cultural integration would gradually eliminate the distinctiveness that had historically motivated resistance to outside authority. Propaganda celebrating these achievements spread throughout the Mediterranean world, with carefully crafted messages designed for different audiences. Roman citizens learned of victories that eliminated dangerous enemies while establishing profitable relationships with wealthy realms. Greek cities heard of liberation from barbarous tyranny and restoration of civilized government. Populations throughout the Orient discovered that submission brought protection and prosperity rather than exploitation and oppression. The triumph celebrated upon return to Rome in 61 BC represented the culmination of achievements that surpassed anything in the Republic's history. Captive treasures displayed during the procession demonstrated the wealth that victory had brought to Roman coffers, while exotic animals and foreign representatives illustrated the geographic scope of territories now acknowledging Roman supremacy. Most significantly, the peaceful transformation of the most dangerous enemies into cooperative allies proved that diplomacy could achieve results that pure action had failed to accomplish. Yet the very completeness of these achievements contained implications that would influence the Republic's future development in ways that contemporary observers could barely imagine. The concentration of authority that had enabled success created precedents for personal power that transcended traditional constitutional limitations. The wealth acquired through settlement provided resources for political competition that would destabilize republican institutions. Most ominously, the transformation of proud realms into client states demonstrated possibilities for universal dominion that would tempt future commanders to seek even greater achievements. The mountain realm that emerged from this settlement bore little resemblance to the vast empire that had challenged Rome's supremacy just years before. Reduced to traditional boundaries and constrained by treaty obligations, it would survive for centuries as a peaceful client that contributed to regional stability rather than threatening it. Yet within this apparent defeat lay the preservation of institutions and traditions that would enable future recovery when changing circumstances created new opportunities for independence. The stage was set for the final chapters of a remarkable reign that had elevated a regional realm to status before reducing it to client dependency. The king, who had once styled himself ruler of the world, would spend his remaining years managing the delicate balance between preserving his people's welfare and maintaining the loyalty that his survival now required. The greatest empire of the Orient in its age had been transformed into a cautionary tale about the limits of expansion and the costs of challenging Rome's determination to maintain its supremacy. Silence descended upon the palace of Artashat, like snow falling on ancient stones, muffling the sounds of a court that had once resonated with the footsteps of ambassadors from 3 continents. Where foreign princes had once waited in magnificent halls to present tribute from distant lands, now only local nobles gathered to discuss the mundane affairs of a domain reduced to its ancestral boundaries. The King of Kings, who had commanded territories stretching from the Mediterranean to the Caspian, now ruled lands that could be crossed in a week's hard riding. Yet within this apparent diminishment lay unexpected opportunities for a different kind of greatness. Freed from the crushing burdens of governing a transcontinental empire, the monarch could focus his still formidable energies on perfecting the administration of his remaining territories. The wealth that tribute from conquered provinces had once provided was replaced by the steady prosperity that came from developing local resources and encouraging trade through the mountain passes that geography had placed under his control. The first challenge to this new order came not from external enemies, but from within his own family. The crown prince, who had grown to manhood during the years of expansion, found it impossible to accept the reduced circumstances that his father's submission had created. Young, ambitious, and educated in the traditions of universal monarchy that had briefly made the Highland kingdom the greatest power in the East, he viewed the treaty with the Western Empire as a temporary setback rather than a permanent reality. Secret communications between the prince and Parthian agents began almost immediately after the settlement was finalized. The Arsacid court at Ctesiphon, though officially maintaining peaceful relations with the Western powers, remained deeply interested in any opportunity to weaken Latin influence in regions they considered part of their traditional sphere. The prospect of a civil war that might destabilize arrangements throughout the Orient was too tempting for Parthian strategists to ignore. The rebellion that erupted in 65 BC caught even experienced observers by surprise with its scope and coordination. The prince had spent months building support among nobles, who resented the constraints that the treaty had imposed on their traditional privileges, while Parthian gold had purchased the loyalty of tribal chieftains along the borders who provided both recruits and secure bases for resistance operations. Most dangerously, the uprising had attracted support from elements within the army who remained loyal to the vision that the king had seemingly abandoned. The aging monarch faced a crisis that tested every aspect of the political skills he had developed during 40 years of rulership. Open warfare against his own son would not only devastate his domain, but also provide the Western Empire with justification for direct intervention that might eliminate independence entirely. Yet allowing the rebellion to succeed would destabilize the carefully negotiated arrangements that had preserved both his throne and his people's welfare. The solution required diplomacy more delicate than any he had ever attempted. Western observers monitored these developments with intense interest, understanding that the outcome would significantly influence their long-term position throughout the region. Pompey's settlement had assumed that the Highland king possessed sufficient authority to maintain stability within his reduced domains, but the current crisis suggested that this assumption might prove fatally flawed. Preparations began for intervention that would ensure Western interests, regardless of how the internal conflict resolved itself. The confrontation between father and son unfolded not through dramatic battles, but through a patient campaign of political maneuvering that demonstrated the older king's superior understanding of realities. Rather than attempting to crush the rebellion through force, he systematically undermined its foundations by offering amnesty to followers, while isolating the prince from his sources of external support. Most crucially, he convinced key Western officials that the uprising represented precisely the kind of instability that their treaty had been designed to prevent. Western pressure on Parthia to end their support for the rebellion proved decisive in determining the conflict's outcome. Faced with the choice between backing a risky venture that might provoke broader confrontation with the Western Empire or maintaining the profitable stability that current arrangements provided, the Arsacid court gradually withdrew their assistance from the prince's cause. Without external resources to sustain operations against his father's superior local support, the rebellion began collapsing from within. The final confrontation between father and son took place not on a battlefield, but in the throne room of Artashat, where family loyalty ultimately proved stronger than political ambition. Contemporary accounts describe how the aging king embraced his rebellious heir while offering forgiveness that restored family unity without undermining royal authority. The prince's submission demonstrated that even the most serious internal threats could be resolved through wisdom and patience rather than violence and repression. Yet this family reconciliation came at costs that would influence the kingdom's future development for generations. The need to placate supporters of the rebellion required political concessions that weakened central authority, while strengthening regional nobles whose loyalty remained questionable. More importantly, the episode had demonstrated to the Western Empire the fragility of Highland stability and the potential need for more direct oversight of internal affairs. The reforms that followed the rebellion's resolution reflected lessons learned from both the crisis itself and the broader challenges of governing a reduced but still complex domain. The feudal system that had characterized traditional governance was systematically modernized to create more direct royal control over local affairs, while preserving the cultural autonomy that mountain nobles considered essential to their identity. These governmental innovations drew heavily on Persian models that the king remembered from his youth at the Parthian court, but they were adapted to local conditions and constraints that differed significantly from those that had shaped our Sassanid administration. Regional governors, appointed by the crown, replaced hereditary local rulers in areas where loyalty was questionable, while traditional authorities retained their positions in districts that had demonstrated consistent support for royal policies. Economic development became a central focus of royal attention, as the monarch sought to replace the wealth that tribute had once provided with prosperity, generated through domestic production and international trade. The mountain kingdom's position, astride major commercial routes between Europe and Asia, remained as valuable as ever, and careful cultivation of these opportunities could provide revenues sufficient to maintain both internal stability and external independence. Agricultural improvements implemented throughout the land demonstrated the sophisticated understanding of rural economics that had been developed during decades of rule. Irrigation projects that had been neglected during the years of external expansion received renewed attention, while new techniques learned from deportees who had been settled throughout the territory during its phase were systematically disseminated to increase overall productivity. The cultural renaissance that characterized the final decades represented perhaps the greatest achievement as a ruler. Freed from the pressures that had dominated attention during the period, resources and energy could be devoted to patronage of arts and learning that created lasting monuments to Highland civilization. The palace workshops that had once produced weapons and siege equipment now crafted luxury goods whose artistic quality rivaled anything produced in the Mediterranean world. Greek theatrical productions performed in the amphitheatre at Artashat attracted audiences from throughout the region, while providing entertainment that reinforced both cultural sophistication and political loyalty. These performances typically adapted classical works to reflect local themes and values, creating a distinctive synthesis that celebrated identity while acknowledging the broader cultural heritage of the Hellenistic world. The annual festival that accompanied these productions became one of the most significant cultural events in the entire region. Literary development flourished under royal patronage, as court scholars began systematic efforts to preserve and celebrate traditions through written works that would survive for future generations. Historical chronicles that recorded the achievements of the period were composed alongside poetry that celebrated the natural beauty and cultural distinctiveness of the mountain homeland. Most importantly, legal treatises codified the governmental innovations that had emerged from decades of practical experience in ruling diverse populations. The coinage produced during this period provides remarkable insights into how the monarch sought to balance acknowledgement of Western supremacy with preservation of royal dignity and local pride. Royal portraits on these coins depicted him wearing traditional regalia, while incorporating symbolic elements that indicated his status within the broader imperial system. The inscriptions carefully avoided claims to universal authority while emphasizing his role as protector and benefactor of his people. Religious developments during the final decades reflected the theological sophistication that had characterized Highland culture since the kingdom's founding. The synthesis of Zoroastrian principles with local traditions that had emerged during the phase was refined and systematized through scholarly efforts that created distinctive religious practices. These innovations would prove remarkably durable, providing spiritual foundations that would sustain identity through centuries of foreign domination. Educational institutions established throughout the territory ensured that future generations would possess the skills necessary to maintain the cultural achievements of the reign. Schools attached to temples and royal residences provided instruction not only in traditional subjects, but also in Greek, Persian, and Latin languages that would be essential for participation in the broader Mediterranean world. The curriculum developed for these institutions balanced practical training in administration and commerce with philosophical and literary studies that would preserve intellectual traditions. The diplomatic relationships cultivated during the final years demonstrated continued skill in managing the complex international environment that surrounded the reduced domain. Careful maintenance of Western friendship was balanced with preservation of ties to Parthia and other powers, creating a network of relationships that protected interests while avoiding entanglement in conflicts between greater powers. Marriage alliances arranged for members of the royal family illustrated the careful calculation that characterized these diplomatic efforts. Unions with Western nobles provided security against potential aggression while demonstrating integration into the elite. Simultaneously, connections with Parthian and other dynasties preserved options for future policy adjustments if circumstances changed. These family bonds created personal relationships that transcended purely political considerations. The building projects that marked the final decades reflected both continued wealth and the desire to create lasting monuments to achievements. The expansion of Artashat included construction of new quarters that could accommodate the growing population attracted by the city's prosperity, while improvements to existing structures demonstrated the refined artistic tastes that characterized mature Highland culture. These architectural achievements would influence regional building styles for centuries. Commercial policies implemented during this period successfully transformed the territory from tribute collector to prosperous trading center. The elimination of the expensive establishments that had been necessary during the expansion phase freed resources for infrastructure investments that encouraged economic development. Roads, bridges, and market facilities constructed throughout the land created conditions that attracted merchants from distant regions while generating revenues through carefully calibrated taxation. The succession arrangements that began developing as the king aged reflected both the desire to preserve family rule and understanding of the constraints that the Western relationship imposed on future policy options. The reconciliation with his eldest son had resolved immediate succession questions, but the need to ensure Western approval of any future ruler required careful preparation of potential heirs for the diplomatic responsibilities they would inherit. Education provided for the younger generation of the royal family emphasized skills that would be essential for maintaining independence within the Western system. Language training enabled communication with officials in their own tongue, while instruction in law and customs provided understanding of the framework within which future rulers would operate. Training focused on defensive rather than offensive capabilities, reflecting the reality that future security would depend on Western protection rather than independent strength. The gradual decline in health during the 50s BC created succession pressures that tested all the careful preparations that had been made for this transition. The king, who had once commanded armies across 3 continents, now struggled with the physical limitations of advanced age, while the political challenges of maintaining stability during a regency required delegation of authority that he had previously kept concentrated in his own hands. The final years witnessed a remarkable transformation in how contemporaries viewed the monarch's historical significance. Where the phase had generated fear and hostility throughout the Mediterranean world, his later achievements as a client ruler earned respect for the wisdom and skill required to preserve his people's welfare under such constrained circumstances. Western historians began portraying him as an example of how rulers could benefit from cooperation with authority. When death finally came, around 55 BC, it marked the end of an era that had seen the Mountain Kingdom rise to unprecedented heights before adapting to dramatically reduced circumstances. The king, who had briefly ruled territories spanning from the Black Sea to the Red Sea, was mourned throughout a land that had learned to find prosperity and honor within more modest boundaries. His funeral became a celebration of achievements that had elevated Highland culture to levels that would influence the region's development for centuries. The succession that followed demonstrated both the strengths and the weaknesses of the governmental system that had been created during the long reign. While the immediate transition proceeded smoothly under arrangements that had been carefully prepared, the underlying tensions between aspirations and Western constraints would continue to challenge successors. The territory that had once dominated the Orient would survive as a peaceful client, but the dreams of universal monarchy would haunt imagination for generations to come. The legacy would prove more complex and enduring than contemporary observers could have imagined. The transformation from regional prince to conqueror to wise client ruler provided lessons about the possibilities and limitations of political achievement that would influence thinking throughout the ancient world. Most importantly, success in preserving identity and independence, even within the constraints of foreign supremacy, created precedents for cultural survival that would serve the people well during the challenging centuries that lay ahead. The funeral pyre of Tigranes the Great blazed against the autumn sky, like a second sun, its flames reaching toward the snow-capped peaks that had witnessed the rise and transformation of the greatest monarch the mountains had ever produced. From across the realm they had come, nobles who remembered the glory days when their king's armies had marched to the Mediterranean, merchants whose caravans had once carried tribute from 3 continents, and common folk whose lives had been shaped by the vision of a ruler who had dared to challenge the world itself. In the marble halls of Rome, senators received word of the death with complex emotions that reflected the extraordinary nature of the relationship that had developed between the Republic and its most formidable former enemy. Here was a man who had once commanded armies that threatened the very foundations of Latin power, yet who had spent his final decades as one of Rome's most reliable allies in the turbulent politics of the Orient. The transformation from mortal enemy to trusted friend represented a diplomatic achievement that would influence policy for generations. Marcus Tullius Cicero, reflecting on the monarch's career in letters to his friend Atticus, captured the paradox that defined his legacy. In him, we witnessed the rarest of transformations, from conqueror to peacemaker, from destroyer to builder, from the pride that seeks dominion over all, to the wisdom that finds greatness in serving one's people well. Rome has lost not an enemy conquered, but an ally whose friendship was more valuable than his enmity had been dangerous. The succession proceeded with the smooth efficiency that marked the final achievement of the great king's political skill. Artavasdes II, tempered by years of careful preparation and sobered by his father's example, assumed the crown with full understanding of both its privileges and its limitations. The ceremony itself embodied the careful balance that had characterized the later years, ancient Highland traditions combined with acknowledgement of the broader world within which the realm now operated. Roman representatives attended the coronation not as conquerors observing a subject people, but as allies, witnessing the continuation of arrangements that had brought unprecedented prosperity to both powers. The gifts they brought included not only the traditional tokens of friendship, but also guarantees that the new king would enjoy the same protection and respect that his father had earned through wisdom and loyalty. The the student had become master of the delicate art of ruling within constraints while maintaining dignity and independence. Yet beneath the ceremonial harmony lay tensions that would shape the kingdom's future for centuries to come. The younger generation of nobles, educated in the stories of their fathers' conquests, but knowing only the limited boundaries of the present, struggled with dreams that exceeded contemporary possibilities. In their minds burned visions of restored greatness that time would neither extinguish nor make achievable through the methods that had once elevated their ancestors to dominion over half the world. The Parthian court at Ctesiphon watched these developments with calculations that reflected their own complex relationship with the Highland realm. The Arsacid monarchs had never forgotten that their former ward had once commanded territories that rivaled their own, while they recognized that the current arrangements served their interests better than any likely alternative. The balance of friendship and suspicion that characterized this relationship would influence the politics of the Orient for generations. In Damascus and Antioch, in the ports of Phoenicia, where Armenian merchants still traded under Roman protection, in the mountain passes where caravans continued their ancient journeys between east and west, the memory of the great king's achievements lived on in more practical forms. The commercial networks he had established, the cultural synthesis he had fostered, and the governmental innovations he had pioneered continued to influence daily life long after his political dominion had ended. The religious legacy proved equally enduring as the theological developments of his reign continued to shape spiritual life throughout the region. The synthesis of Zoroastrian, Hellenistic, and indigenous traditions that had emerged under royal patronage provided frameworks for understanding divine purpose that would influence religious thinking for centuries. The concept of righteous kingship serving cosmic order became embedded in Highland consciousness, creating expectations for royal behavior that would constrain and inspire future rulers. In its final decades, the reign saw the library at Artashat flourish into a beacon of knowledge, drawing scholars from across the known world. Here, the traditions of Greece and Persia, of Mesopotamia, and the Highlands themselves were preserved and synthesized into new forms of knowledge that advanced human understanding. The kings who followed, however limited their political authority, continued this intellectual patronage as one area where they could still achieve greatness. Cultural developments that had flourished under the great monarch's rule continued to evolve and spread throughout the region. The distinctive artistic style that had emerged from the fusion of multiple traditions influenced everything from palace architecture to common pottery, creating a Highland aesthetic that would remain recognizable for centuries. The literary works composed during this period provided models for future generations, while preserving the memory of achievements that had briefly elevated their people to world prominence. Once a grand capital, Tigranocerta's rebirth as a peaceful provincial center mirrored the larger changes that redefined the surrounding lands. Where once exotic treasures from across the world had filled royal storehouses, now local artisans produced goods whose quality reflected inherited skills rather than imperial wealth. The cosmopolitan population that had made the city unique gradually dispersed, but their descendants carried with them cultural knowledge that enriched communities throughout the realm. The engineering achievements of the reign, the roads, bridges, and fortifications that had enabled transcontinental rule, continued to serve more modest purposes as infrastructure for local commerce and defense. Roman engineers who studied these works found innovations that influenced their own techniques, while the Highland craftsmen who maintained them preserved skills that would prove valuable in future generations. The physical foundations of empire had become the mundane necessities of regional administration. Reflections on the king's life and rule echoed far beyond his borders, influencing how power was understood in distant lands. His rise demonstrated that vision and capability could elevate even modest realms to extraordinary heights, while his adaptation to defeat showed that wisdom might preserve essential achievements, even when broader ambitions proved unsustainable. The combination of military prowess, diplomatic skill, and administrative innovation that had characterized his rule provided models for future leaders facing similar challenges. In place of direct control, client arrangements allowed Highland influence to flow through the region, aligning local goals with a broader peace. Former subject territories maintained commercial and cultural connections that preserved beneficial aspects of integration, while eliminating the political tensions that had ultimately proven unsustainable. This voluntary association accomplished through mutual benefit what conquest had achieved temporarily through force. Long after their battles ended, the methods that made the Highland troops legendary still guided the art of war in the region. The tactical innovations, training methods, and organizational structures that had enabled small numbers of mountain warriors to defeat vastly superior forces provided lessons that were studied and adapted by armies from the Atlantic to the Indus. The transformation of Highland military potential from offensive to defensive capabilities preserved security while eliminating the threat that had made the realm so dangerous to its neighbors. In the schools that had been established throughout the realm, young nobles learned languages and customs that prepared them for leadership in a changed world. Greek, Latin, and Persian joined the Highland tongue as essential elements of elite education, while instruction in law, administration, and diplomacy equipped future leaders for the complex relationships that would govern their lives. The cosmopolitan outlook that had characterized the great king's court became embedded in the education of those who would follow him. The marriage alliances that connected the Highland royal family with ruling houses throughout the region created personal bonds that transcended political arrangements. These relationships provided insurance against future conflicts while creating opportunities for beneficial cooperation that served multiple interests. The children of these unions carried within their heritage the cultural synthesis that had been the reign's greatest achievement. Celebratory writings ensured that the monarch's story would endure, capturing not only the outcome, but the spirit of the journey. These works preserved tactical knowledge, diplomatic wisdom, and administrative innovation in forms that could inspire and instruct long after immediate political circumstances had changed. The transformation of historical achievement into cultural memory created a legacy that would outlast any particular political arrangement. What the reign achieved became more than history. It shaped a vision of Highland greatness that future generations would both honor and struggle to uphold. The knowledge that their ancestors had once commanded the world created expectations and ambitions that would influence Highland politics for centuries, while the practical experience of rule provided wisdom about both the possibilities and the limitations of political achievement. The economic foundations that had supported expansion, control of trade routes, development of local resources, and careful management of human capital continued to generate prosperity that made the reduced realm one of the most stable and prosperous regions in the Orient. The transformation from tribute collector to trading partner had actually increased long-term wealth while eliminating the military expenses that had consumed so much imperial revenue. Designed for empire, these administrative systems adapted smoothly to older territories, delivering justice and efficiency that strengthened royal legitimacy. The bureaucratic innovations, legal reforms, and administrative procedures that had enabled unified rule of diverse populations created foundations for internal stability that would endure long after external boundaries had contracted. In the mountain monasteries, where scribes continued copying ancient texts, in the trading posts where merchants from distant lands still gathered to exchange goods and information, in the royal workshops where craftsmen maintained traditions of excellence that had once served imperial needs, the practical legacy of the Great Reign continued to influence daily life. The vision had been reduced, but the skills and knowledge that had made it possible remained embedded in Highland civilization. The example that Tigranes had provided of how remarkable leadership could transform circumstances while adapting to realities beyond any individual's control would inspire and instruct rulers throughout the ancient world. His career demonstrated that true greatness lay not in the scope of one's dominion, but in the wisdom with which authority was exercised and the legacy one left for future generations. The reign of Tigranes, the Great, offered a full lesson in both the heights and limits of political ambition. A mountain kingdom's brief rise to greatness, followed by a return to quiet prosperity. His transformation from hostage to conqueror to wise king provided lessons about leadership, adaptation, and legacy that would remain relevant as long as human beings continued to aspire to greatness. After reaching the edges of the known world, the Highland power returned to its mountains, carrying both the weight of wisdom and the wealth of experience. The King of Kings was dead, but the example he had provided of how vision, skill, and adaptability could elevate any people to achievements that seemed impossible lived on in the institutions he had created, the culture he had fostered, and the memory of what had been briefly but memorably accomplished in an age when anything seemed possible for those bold enough to attempt greatness. In the end, perhaps that was the truest measure of his achievement, not the territories conquered or the treasures gathered, but the demonstration that human ambition, properly directed and wisely constrained, could transform the world itself. The empire had fallen, but the example endured, an eternal crown whose luster would never fade as long as human beings continued to dream of what remarkable leadership might accomplish against impossible odds.